Seasons Freedom, Helldivers, Capitalistic Entrepreneurs, and Erstwhile Eddie. If you're playing Inno 117, it's time for another episode of Signal Interference, and this one is pretty darn topical. Let's get real here, fellow game-hopping titans. The Thanksgiving fluffing sucks. It always has, always will. Stop expecting it to get any better because it just isn't. Every year, we have to do prep work that we don't want to do, deal with crowds at the score that we would honestly rather skip, buy things from meals that we aren't looking forward to, with money we don't have, gather on tables that we didn't ask for, and converse with bigoted relatives that we just don't like. It's the kind of social battlefield that the Illuminate wish they had the ability to conjure, and if you're transgender, buckle up, soldier, because you can count on at least a baker's dozen dead names before dessert is even served, and at least one toothless uncle who thinks that he's Sun Tzu because he watched Fox News between naps. Let's be honest here, though. Nobody likes Uncle Jerry anyway. At least we get mashed potatoes, and the only thing my husband cooks better than Terminus with a napalm drop is a big old 18-pound bird. He just bastes it so masterfully. Irritating bigoted relatives aside, why do I have such animosity towards Thanksgiving? Well, it has to do a lot with its origins. The great Hallmark lie, as I like to call it. Not because Hallmark had anything to do with this, but because it all covers up an atrocious amount of spilled blood and cultural erasure with a lovely little Christian family-friendly story that would befit an after-school special from the 60s. Allow me to take you on a little history lesson expedition. Trust me, by the time that I get to the end of this, you are going to despise this holiday at least as much as I do. Maybe more. First, let's get the obvious stuff out of the way. The Pilgrim and, I want to say, Wampanoag feast in 1621? You know, the thing that is depicted here, and here, and here. It was never actually called Thanksgiving. What was going down here was a harvest celebration, and even that is being generous. It was never actually called Thanksgiving. You've been lied to. Don't worry, that word will come later. So, if it's not Thanksgiving, what exactly is going down here? Sure looks like Thanksgiving. Well, the native peoples that you see here showed up because they heard gunfire coming from the Plymouth colony. Their leader, whose name I'm probably going to butcher, Massasoit... Oh, you know what, it's on screen, heck with it. Figured that it would be a good idea to investigate what was going on. His people had a mutual defense treaty going on with the Plymouth Pilgrims, and if there was a threat, it's probably a good idea to take it down together instead of off by themselves. There was no attack. The Pilgrims just like to fire guns into the air during the celebration. I'm certain that you've seen this at the 4th of July. Yeah, the natives got tricked by a bunch of drunk rednecks who would probably go on later to support the Second Amendment right before shooting themselves in the foot. Yeah, I can see why they wanted to revise this little embarrassing corner of history. Since the Wampanoag were already there, it would have been rude not to feed them, so might as well. They enjoyed such dishes as cornmeal porridge, fish, and other such bounties of the sea, pumpkins, squash, some nuts, and other forage materials, and the Wampanoag helped out by downing a few deer for the venison, just to fill out the menu. Mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, stuffing, and especially pies were not present. Honestly, I don't know where we got that from. Probably some amount of cultural diffusion or another. But the worst part of all of this is that it did nothing to create harmony, but rather mark the beginning of tensions. See, the colonists were already aggressively expanding onto lands that did not belong to them, violate treaties and other such agreements with the Wampanoag, and the power imbalance was shifting as more and more settlers arrived. All of this was going to cultivate into what is known as King Philip's War, one of the deadliest conflicts in American colonial history. It was not a symbol of lasting peace, but a brief calm before a cataclysmic cat storm. The art is pretty, though. Now, all of this was to serve the purpose of elucidating what Thanksgiving is not about. I'm about to tell you what it is about. Massacre, genocide, erasure. You know, the usual suspects. In the 1630s, the Pequot people were the dominant power in southern New England, controlling various trade routes and wielding enormous economic power. The settlers wanted that power broken. Why? Why else? Money. The Pequot people controlled the fur trade in the local region. Beaver, otter, moose, and hats made from these were a gigantic industry in Europe. I mean, it doesn't take a super-Earth rocket surgeon to see the connection. A limited resource multiplied by distance and amped up by continental scarcity. If you can't make money under those conditions, you flat out cannot make money. The only problem in this situation is that those resources just so happen to be owned by somebody else. But that's a problem that colonizers are very good at dealing with. This all came to a head with the death of John Oldham, which these settlers blamed on the Pequot tribe. No, before you ask, the Pequot didn't actually kill this guy. That's just manufactured justification. You know, like what happened with Charlie Kirk and how badly conservatives desperately tried to blame my community for that. And after nobody, and I mean nobody, was buying that bogus text message exchange, they just quietly buried it and prepared for the next attempt to, erase us all. Heck, I think most of the people in my community who saw violence or harassment because of that didn't even leave the house on the day of the shooting, but as we are about to explore, when people want justification for inflicting violence and cruelty on somebody else, they can ride on the most paper-thin of excuses, and common sense never shows up for work. John Oldham was not a good guy. He was belligerent, bigoted, aggressive, openly hostile to pretty much everybody, and had already been banished from Plymouth Colony years prior for his behavior. It was inevitable that he would meet up with somebody less tolerant who just wouldn't stand for that sort of thing. Well, by liberty he sure got it, with the Menacene people of Block Island, who were loosely affiliated with the Narragansett tribe. Oldham had a really nasty, unfortunate habit of scamming other people that he saw as inferior, and it was a matter of time before that caught up to him. See, here's the thing about all of this. The really crucial, critical part. The settlers knew that the Pequot did not kill Oldham. The Narragansett knew it. Everyone knew it. The killers confessed to the crime, but told the Narragansett leadership what had happened. We were horrified because they knew what was about to go down, and this information was passed on to the colonists straight away. But the Pilgrims didn't care, because this was the perfect casus belli required for escalation. Casus belli translated from Latin to mean case for war. Again, just like what happened with Charlie Kirk. Some things never change, and some approaches don't age. I do not agree with what happened to him. Heck, until a few months ago, I didn't even know who that one dude was. But I will say that he was one of the most eloquent speakers of our time. I have never seen anyone argue for the exact metric of their death in such a way that it brings about its inevitable actuality. Bridging the metaphor, nobody celebrated Oldham's death, but nobody was shocked that it happened either. Everybody knew that he was borscht, and everyone knew it was just an excuse to go to war. Now, with all of this in mind, it really sours what happened next. The English Puritan militia, with the aid of the Mohegan and, of all people, the Narragansett native allies who wanted to undermine the economic power of the Pequot, attacked a number of villages, mostly filled with unarmed women, children, elders, so on. They stood no chance. Their leader, John Mason, said, and I quote, "We must burn them." And so they did. They burned between 400 and 700 people alive in less than an hour. Women, children, unarmed. Anyone who tried to escape the blaze was shot or cut down. What happened to the women? It's too horrible to mention. It turns my gut just thinking about it. The Narragansett felt the same way, and they begged Mason to stop, saying that this was too much. He refused. He told them to go fluff themselves. The aftermath of this was just more cruelty. Always more. The Pequot were completely broken as a political force, and yet it still was not enough. The survivors were tracked down, most were killed on sight, and others were captured and sold into slavery. Some were distributed between the Mohegan and Narragansett tribes as tribute later, and the Pilgrims declared the Pequot people extinct. Can you just imagine taking action like this against your rival and seeing something like that happen to them? And then you get their children as slaves, and you have to go for the rest of their lives knowing that you burned their parents alive. This right here is why I am neither of the right or left politically. My stance is anti-cruelty. I am on the side of life. I always have been. And I think this might be the most depressing script that I ever wrote. But bear with me because I'm not done yet, and I know what you're thinking. Dear God, how could they do more? The Pilgrims passed laws erasing the Pequot name, their customs, any sort of cultural identification. For all intents and purposes, it was the conclusion of physical and cultural genocide. This brings me to the crux of my argument. Why Thanksgiving sucks. Following the massacre, the colonial governor, John Winthrop of the Massachusetts colony, declared it a day of Thanksgiving. Not to mourn, not to reflect, not to allow for a moment of introspection. The Puritans thanked God for letting them burn hundreds of men, women, and children alive, and they called it Thanksgiving, to slay entire families and thank God for the screams. That word is soaked in blood, in tears, in war crimes, and in misery, all in the name of imagined vengeance and greed. I'm just gonna come out and say it right now. If your God commands you to burn women and children alive, then your God is evil. Putting it into stark comparison, 25 people died as a result of the Salem witch trials, and that was spread out over several months. Everybody remembers that. It's in every history book. At least 16 times more people died of the Pequot massacre, and this is probably the first time anyone in my audience is hearing about it, all for what Christian nationalists have their f***ing Hallmark moment. But, a plot hole. Since this bloodbath happened in May, how did we get to November? Well, we have Sarah Hale to thank for that. She's the nice lady who wrote the Mary Had a Little Lamb song and wanted to straighten up Thanksgiving as a national holiday for decades. You see, before then, Thanksgiving was really just a day that happened whenever you wanted to give thanks to God for, I don't know, triumphing over a rival by burning their children alive or doing well in school. Very little middle ground in between. To her eye, the date made sense. Harvest festivals often took place in November. It wouldn't compete with Christmas, and by 1863, Abraham Lincoln made it official. At first glance, Sarah Hale seems like a nice lady. She was the editor of her own magazine, I think it's Gaudy Ladies Book, reaching hundreds of thousands of households, and was considered one of the most influential women of the 19th century, at least as far as America was concerned. She also had a very rigid conservative moral vision where history should inspire pride, not criticism, where morality came from piety, motherhood, and obedience, where America is a divinely chosen nation, where women belong to the home, or in the kitchen, and should not be speaking in public, voting, or entering most professions. Except for herself, of course. She had to stay working on her magazine because it was God's will. Rules for thee, not for me. My, that's convenient. She also worked very, very hard to erase certain historical inconveniences, like the Pequot massacre that would undermine her view as America being God's chosen. Work which I am now undoing. Because not only am I anti-cruelty, I am also pro-liberty, and I see her as standing in the way of that. I imagine the internalized misogyny must have rotted her poor brain. Most people that I've talked to about this have absolutely no idea of Thanksgiving's bloody history. They just think turkey, pumpkin pie, mashed potatoes, and maybe we can survive racist Uncle Jerry for another year. The part that rubs me the wrong way about this is that this is all still going on. There is a vicious beast that lives at the heart of our culture, and it's still there. It's the blueprint that America is still working off of. Nobody learned their lesson from this. You saw it in the South with Jim Crow. You saw it in World War II with Japanese internment. You see it every time that Trump talks about immigrants. And you see it every time a politician passes yet another law against trans people. There's always someone else that needs to be erased for the greater good. Another culture that needs to be excised. More blood that needs to be spilled. And that beast grows hungry yet again. There are some of my colleagues who just want to enjoy a meal with their friends and families, ignore the history behind this holiday, and just have a good time. I must confess, I lack the strength required for that. I am not capable of that kind of thing, because all I see is the blood. All I see is how conservatives are so eager to rewrite history to make themselves look like God's chosen, as their desire to spill yet more blood once again wears heavy upon them. All I see is, in the thickest of quotes, a holy day, telling marginalized people to smile, eat, and celebrate the lives that erased you while we work on the next set of people to be erased. Hard f***ing pass.